Good afternoon to everybody. We are truly honored to have a distinguished guest who has been at the forefront of education policy. I apologize about my bird, and reform for decades. He's also someone that I am proud to call my friend. Lance Izumi is the Senior Director of the Center for Education at the Pacific Research Institute. In this role, he has been instrumental in shaping discussions around educational choice, accountability, and innovation. His insights have been featured in major publications, and his influence extends beyond research as he has advised policymakers at the state and national levels. Today, he joins us to talk about his latest work, The Great Classroom Collapse.
Much, Shelley. I really appreciate that to be able to be on with you, and also with all of your members of SBMA. It's terrific. Thanks a lot for organizing this.
Absolutely. Well, to start, I guess let's start with what inspired you to write The Great Classroom Collapse.
Well, I appreciate that question, actually. So here's the book. It's The Great Classroom Collapse. And, it came out about a month or so ago, and it's been doing very well. I had a really terrific article that I wrote on the book that took up 2 pages of the New York Post Sunday edition a couple of weeks ago. And I've been on TV and radio talking about the book. Just in fact, had a great article on the book written in the publication, The College Fix, which came out today. So if anyone wants to read that. Anyway, but the reason why I wrote this book, The Great Classroom Collapse, is because, no matter which state you're in, we're all feeling the impact of collapsing student performance. Doesn't matter if you're in California, Virginia, where you're in, Shelley, or any of the other states that your members are in and represent their boards and schools. We're all seeing a collapse in learning in the basic subjects, math and reading. When you look at the national test scores, right, the National Assessment for Education Progress, and you see that, by the 8th grade, 70% or so of 8th graders who are taking the reading and math tests on the NAEP exam are not proficient in those subjects. So, that is a massive number of kids who are not proficient in the fundamental core subjects. And what happens to them as they go on, they're not going to get any better as they go on through high school, and if they go into college, we can talk about that, what happens to those kids once they get to higher education. One thing you didn't mention in your introduction, which thank you very much for that kind introduction. I spent 2 terms as the president of the Board of Governors of the California Community College System. So we're the largest system of higher education in the country. We have 116 community colleges in California. We have over 2 million students. And, we are seeing that in our system and in the other systems, not only in our state, but all around the country. And again, we can talk about the impact of low performance in K-12 on higher education. But what I wanted to do in this book was to, go beyond those numbers, because all of us on this call are, know how bad things are, at least in terms of test scores, whether it's the national test or your state test. Here in California, our California state tests mirror basically the test scores of the national exams. And I'm sure there's a lot of similarity in your state test, wherever you happen to be. And so we know that, but what's causing it? And I think that's the thing that when people, the average person, might read the newspaper and see the latest AP story on low test scores, they wonder, well, why is this happening? How come, our students are not able to read? How come they're not able to do math? And so I wanted to go down and dive a little deeper into behind those numbers and find out why that was happening. And in order to do so, and this is the thing, is that, I'm the director of a think tank, right? I'm head of our education unit, been head of our education unit for the past 30 years. And I remember when I first came into this business that, I just wanted to do all this research, right? And if I did the best research I could do and put it in front of people, people would be convinced, and everything would be nirvana, right? It'd be utopia. And but then I found out that even if you did the best research, and I see Marty nodding his head, even if you did the best research, something, no one's going to read it, because who wants to read, just numbers and statistics and all of that sort of thing? No matter how powerful you think those statistics are, they're still statistics, and people's eyes glaze over. So what I wanted to do was to write a book that weaves, yes, some solid research, but really the core of this book is really the personal stories of teachers and students and parents and tutors and professors and even state legislators. Talk to them as individuals, see what they're going through in the classroom, and understand what the problems are, what the challenges are in their individual lives, because really what they're going through is really a microcosm for what's going on all throughout the country. Every person that I interview for this book is a person who really is typifies what's going on in classroom after classroom, school after school, district after district, state after state, all across the country. And so each chapter in my book is the story, a profile of a particular person, and tells their story about what's going on in their school, in their classroom, or with their children, and with their districts. And so I think it's very powerful to hear from these people and what they're going through, again, but also interweaving some research to buttress what they're saying, that what they're saying is really what's true. And so what they're feeling instinctively is actually buttressed and supported by the research. And so that's what I've tried to do. And one last thing before we can move on to your other questions, but the book is divided into three main categories. So the first section is on the issue of equity and how that impacts the classroom, especially nowadays with this woke concept of equity. The second part of the book is on reading and how poor reading instructional methodologies have just cratered reading achievement in this country. And the third section is on mathematics. And again, how poor curriculum, poor standards, and poor teaching methods have just imploded the learning of mathematics among students nationwide. And so those are the three sections of the book. It's a very easy read, for an education book. I think that people will be very gripped by the stories of people, and because a lot of them are actually emotional stories, and that's something that you don't often get. And so anyway, that's kind of the whole background of the book, why I wrote the book, and what's contained in the book.
No, I love the stories, the individual stories, because I think that's what, like you said, people connect to, and it makes those numbers real. Your book, you talked about equity, the equity agenda in public schools. Can you elaborate on how equity is currently being implemented in the education system and how this approach has contributed to the decline of academic merit and rigor?
Absolutely. So as I say, in that first section of the book, I discussed the issue of equity. And I think that's one of the ubiquitous words we hear all throughout education now. Everything that progressives and the left want to justify, they use the word equity to support it. It's that, well, if we put up a fight against something, well, you can't do that because that will jeopardize equity. Well, what does that mean? First of all, equity means that basically it's a Marxist concept, really, because it's equality versus equity. Equality means that you have the equal opportunity to use your talents, your hard work to reach your highest potential, and it's all based on the individual. Whereas equity is all about groups and classes of people, and so that you want to basically squash the results of all people, like students, so that there's this kind of homogeneous sameness to all the results. And so that even if some kids can do better, you've squashed them down so that they're basically, everybody is performing at the same level. And again, it's a very Marxist concept because it doesn't look at the individual, their efforts, their accountability, their own self-responsibility. It looks at this class dichotomy between the achievers versus the non-achievers, the oppressed versus the oppressor, and and makes that type of classification. And again, with the result that you want this sameness in the results for kids, regardless of whether they merit whatever, let's say, grade or score that they get. And so, what I do in the section on equity is I try to illustrate this by taking the stories of two people. The first chapter is on a student. Her name is Charlotte. I changed her name for anonymity, and she attends a school in Northern California, where I'm not too far from where I'm at, and that school had been a high-performing school for a public school here in California. Had been actually one of the leading public schools in California, and but then the equity wave hit, and so that school. And I know that you're in Virginia, Shelley. I mean, you've had this whole experience with Thomas Jefferson High School, right? With the dumbing down of Thomas Jefferson High School, all in the name of equity. Well, we had the very similar experience with this particular high school here in California, and this high school entrance and admission into this high school was dependent up to just very recently on a merit-based entrance examination. Well, because of equity, and that was going to leave some people out, especially certain racial groups, they decided to go to a lottery system, and that therefore let in anybody, on a random system, regardless of whether they were prepared for the work that the school was going to put on those students. And so what happened? Well, first of all, let me just say that the student I profile, this young woman named Charlotte, she actually had the courage to go to the school board meeting where this change in admissions was being debated, and she argued against it because she said, look, there are all these kids who wanted to get into this school, and they had studied, earned good grades, and had worked themselves to the point where they were going to be ready to take this merit-based exam to get into the school, and yet now you're going to take away that opportunity, and you're going to just give us some random chance in a lottery system. She said that's not fair to all of us who have worked so hard all these years, and we've been made promises that if we worked so hard, we would then be able to get into this school. Well, people retorted against that girl, saying that, well, that's wrong because all the kids who are in that school, and this is a quote from her, all the kids who are in this school are either white supremacists or Asians. which is bizarre, right? Well, wait a second. If you're a white supremacist, then what the heck are the Asians doing there? It's I always tell that my own personal anecdote is that, like, I'm Japanese, right? And so my grandfather in this country, he was a gardener. But during World War II, being Japanese, he was interned in a camp in a swamp in Arkansas, Rower internment camp. So he spent the war in this swamp in Arkansas, and I said that, well, he must be white adjacent because he was adjacent to the guards. And so, anyway, it's just insane, that type of argument. But what happened in that school after they did this change is that everything started to collapse. So the students were not as well prepared, and so therefore the teachers couldn't cover as much ground. Charlotte's chemistry teacher told her that he had to actually reduce the amount of material because he had to go over and over the same material because the kids who were now in the class were not understanding the material. Unfortunately, a lot of the classes ended up being not about the subject matter that was supposed to be taught. Like, for example, the English classes in this school, she said, were teaching things that were not even English. They were teaching things like baking in the English classes. And she said that it had this domino effect, so that courses like social studies, like history, for example, she said her history class actually became a remedial English class because the kids didn't have good English skills. And so instead of being able to, read history, learn about history, they were having to go over how to read a text, how to analyze a text, how to get the ideas out, all of those sorts of things that you should be getting, years before, and certainly in your English classes are having to be retaught in history. And that's, of course, an opportunity cost, right? Any minute, hour, day, week, whatever that you're spending on that is the time not spent on history. So there was all of those problems, and the end product was that that her class had the highest failure rate of any class that in the history of the school. And so that's what equity got them. And I'll just give one other example in the section on equity. I have another chapter where I interview a Minnesota mom, and she's an immigrant from West Africa. She's a true African American. She is from the country of Sierra Leone. She immigrated to this country, managed to settle in Minneapolis area, and she had two kids in a school called the French Immersion School, which is a public school in the Minneapolis area. And it was actually kind of the crown jewel of all the public schools in the Minneapolis area. And it was actually kind of started and run by African people, like Nigerian Americans, people from Cameroon, people from Togo, people from Sierra Leone, all these other countries that were French speaking, and that they would, they helped run the school. And so, unfortunately, it undercut the leftist narrative that at-risk immigrant racial minority kids, cannot perform. Because here's this school that was performing better than most of the other schools in the district. So what did this district do? They didn't try to get other schools to be like this school. They actually started to dumb down the French immersion school in order for it to become just like all the other failures in the district. So they took away the math curriculum that was working so well. They took away, for example, the music courses, all these things that were making this school both successful and unique. And they ended up making a cookie cutter school, to the point that it went from being a very high performing math school to a school that was very poor performing. And she, as not a wealthy person, had to actually get a math tutor for her child for this school, which had previously been so high achieving in math. And she said all these, you would go to Kumon or any of these other after school programs, and you would see that all these immigrant people, like people from Nigeria, people from Somalia, and other countries, India, they were sending their kids to these after school programs because now the school could not provide their kids with math learning in classroom time. And so that's all because of the equity agenda that this district had. And she said, unfortunately, that she saw that district as eventually becoming a money laundering system, so that all the money that came into the school was actually came into the school to basically fund the teachers' unions and administrators, and that it was basically funding failure. And she said the incentives in education are all wrong, that the more failure you get, the more money you get. And that's totally absurd. And so, but that all stems, again, from this equity agenda.
Yeah, we had something when we talked earlier this year in Virginia. They have done something similar, which is they in a lot of the divisions they removed the prerequisites to get into the AP classes. So and similar things were happening where kids were coming in, they weren't prepared for the class, so the teacher had to go backwards, and then you don't get through all the content. That was just one that I could think of off the top of my head, but yeah, I think this is happening everywhere. You
Well,
recently wrote a really great article on equity grading. Can you talk a little bit about equity grading, what that entails, and its impact on student achievement?
Yeah, equity grading is really important. Let me just mention, kind of as a foundation to that, is that the reason why these progressives want to go to equity, quote, their version of equity, right, this sameness, is because they see, they don't like competition. and they don't like the fact that, there are winners and losers, right? And so if you work hard and you put in the effort and you get an A because you're a winner, they view that situation not as, okay, let's try and get the other kids to emulate the kid who put in the effort and worked hard to get that A. They look at it as like, okay, that's creating a group of winners and a group of losers, the kids who are not putting in the effort and who are not doing well. And so therefore, that's why they want to squeeze people into this, lowest common denominator class. And so what equity grading does is that it basically totally changes the grading system. It's really a woke name for grade inflation. And so I wrote an article for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution on this, and I can send the link to, and I believe Shelley has this link, so maybe she can make it available to everybody. But what equity grading does is that it changes the grading system so that what you have is, like on tests, you get multiple chances at taking a test. Okay, you take a test, you get an F. All right, well, no big deal. You just get a chance to take it again, or again, or again. And if you turn in homework late, or don't turn in homework at all, you don't get a 0. You get 50%. That's the bottom. That is the floor for credit. It's not 0, it's 50%. And so, and then some schools will have eliminated D's and F's because of that. And so, you have all these, and then what will often happen too is that in grading, I think a lot of us probably when we were in school, we were probably graded on an absolute grading system, right? A scoring system, right? Where if you got 90%, you got an A. 80% was a B, 70% was a C, etc., right? But under equity grading, what you will often have is a situation where kids are graded on a curve in order to bring up everybody, right? And so that you have a greater chance of kids getting A's and B's if you grade in that system rather than on an absolute scale. And what this ends up doing is that it ends up raising the grade point average of kids, but it doesn't signify that they've actually learned anything. And so if you look at even what the proponents of equity grading argue in their claims, they can never point to the fact that equity grading actually results in increased test scores, right? So that, one of their arguments is that, well, equity grading is important because it won't discourage kids who get bad grades, right? If you would ordinarily get a D, but now you're getting a B, it's like, oh, I'm not going to be discouraged. And so I'm going to maybe try harder and I'll get interested in school. And then I will eventually do better on tests. Well, that doesn't play out at all. First of all, if you do D level work, but then are basically guaranteed a B, you have no incentive to work, right? There's no incentive for you to try harder. And that's what teachers would tell you who have instituted this equity grading, is that there's no incentive for the kids to work harder in order to learn the material if they're guaranteed an A or B. And secondly, because they don't learn more through equity grading, well, of course, when they go and take, let's say, the ACT or the SAT, they're not going to score better simply because they have a high grade point average in high school. And in fact, in studies that have been done on equity grading and test scores, there's like no correlation, right? As equity grading has become more prevalent in the United States and the grade point averages have inflated, the scores of, let's say, the ACT have either been flat during that whole time or gone down. And so therefore, what basically this is doing is it's committing a fraud on these kids who think they're doing well in school, and yet when they go to higher education, and we can talk about this a little bit later, but I have a chapter in this book on what happens to kids once they get into higher education, and what their prospects then are in the job market. But it's a fraud on these kids because they're being told a lie, through the grading system. And so, and when I interviewed that girl Charlotte at that school in Northern California, she said that equity grading was rampant in her school. That despite the fact they had this record failure rate, and kids dropping out because they couldn't handle stuff, kids were getting these second and third and fourth chances to try and get better grades. But because they weren't prepared, they still couldn't handle it. But it just goes to show you that what is important is not changing the system of grading. It's giving these kids those foundational skills in order to do well. If we don't do that, those kids will not only not do well in high school, they won't do well in higher education, they won't do well in the job market. They'll drop out, they'll fail out, or they will be fired. So that's the future for these kids, and you can trace it back to things like equity grading, which, as I say, is a fraud.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think that, I mean, there's so much to talk about there. We'll go on though to the Virginia Literacy Act was enacted to address longstanding issues with literacy instruction. From your perspective, when and why did public schools begin to move away from phonics-based instruction? And what has been the impact of this shift on literacy rates and student learning?
Well, let me first of all say that, I do have a background chapter in the book on, what actually works in reading. So in both the math section and the reading section of my book, in addition to the profile chapters on individual people that I interview, I have an introductory chapter in each one of those sections on what works in reading and what works in math. And so in the reading section of the chapter of the book, what works, really, it's funny. Here in California, the California Teachers Association, the big, powerful teachers union, claims that, reading is an evolving science. Well, that is like pure, and as almost anything that comes out of the California Teachers Association, it's pure BS, right? Because it's not an evolving science. We've known for decades and decades what works when it comes to reading. I'm sure that all of you, know about this, that back in the 1990s, we had the National Reading Panel that literally looked at 100,000 reading studies. And they took the most rigorous reading studies out of that 100,000, and they looked to see, well, what did those rigorous studies find regarding what works when it comes to reading? And basically, it's not rocket science. It was the things that all of us know intuitively. Even if we didn't read a single one of those studies, we know that you got to have phonemic awareness, which is knowing the sounds of letters. You got to have phonics, which is able to map those sounds to letters and to letter combinations, and then to words. And then you have to have vocabulary, you have to have fluency, and you have to have comprehension. So basically, those 5 things make up the science, and that has not changed. I mean, literally, in more than half a century, that has not changed. No matter what the teacher unions say, that has not changed. And so therefore, when you look at what states are doing, the question is are they implementing laws? And the Virginia Literacy Act is probably one of these laws that actually uses this science of reading as the foundation in which to make policy with regard to curricula and instructional materials, whether it's teacher training and preparation programs in higher education, and accreditation and other types of issues. But that type of foundational understanding, based upon these decades of research, must undergird all this policy work. And you would think that something that seems so cut and dried, right? That these decades of research, 100,000 study, blah blah blah. That why are we even arguing about this, right? Why you and I on this webinar spending time talking about this, right? This should be a given, and yet we are, because it just shows you how a bad idea in the wrong hands can spread like a wildfire. And that's what's happened in reading, where we've had progressives who have basically taken over so many of the schools of education at the university level, these teacher preparation programs, and they're using reading instruction, they're teaching reading instructional methods that are totally counter to what all these studies have shown. One of the things that they're teaching is a teaching method called balanced literacy, which I'm sure that a lot of your board members are familiar with. And, you know, included in balanced literacy are things like the 3 cueing method, right? Under 3 cueing, you've probably all heard about this. 3 cueing means that you don't sound out a word, right? Like most of us. Now, just it's funny. My mother is an immigrant from Japan, and so she taught me how to read using phonics, right? We had this old vinyl phonics LP, right? And she had flashcards. And in her broken English, she's like teaching me how to read using phonics in this old LP on our broken down record player. And yet I learned to read, right? And how is it that all these kids, you know, who've got parents who were born in this country, you know, spoke supposedly fluent English and yet can't read? And yet you have, and that's the reason is because of these methods such as the 3 cueing method, where instead of sounding things out, you look at a word and you try and you guess at it, right? You guess at what that word might mean. Well, if it's wrong, you look at the picture that's near that word. And let's say the picture is of a horse, and you then guess horse because there's a picture of a horse there. But then what if the word is not horse, but is actually pony, right? But you still guess horse because you see a horse. Well, then they tell you, well, look at the first letter of that word and then guess based upon the picture and the first letter at what the word might be. So it's basically not the 3 cueing method, it's the 3 guessing method. And even if you do end up getting pony, isn't it so much more inefficient to get to that word like that than to just simply, you know, sound out, you know, Pony is pony, and that's what that word is. And so I think that's one of the big problems is that not only is it ineffective, it's inefficient. And so what happened, I interviewed this woman, and if you read my book, hopefully all of you do, The Great Classroom Collapse, if you read any book, any chapter, read chapter 4. Chapter 4 is where I interview a parent and former teacher named Missy Purcell. And Missy Purcell had taught in an elementary school, taught 5th grade in Georgia. And she was taught in her teacher preparation program, balanced literacy and the 3 cueing method, and taught all these ineffective methods of teaching kids how to read. She was at the University of Georgia, the flagship school university in her state, and she was never taught phonics, decoding, or any of the things in the science of reading. Never. So she goes to her school, and then, of course, what does she do? She ends up teaching using these failed methods. And let me say that these failed methods, again, they have no research basis, and yet they were popularized because there were some gurus within the academic community that said this was the best way to teach reading without any real evidence to show for it, and including a woman named Lucy Calkins, who is a professor at Columbia University and established her own center that propagated these ideas at Columbia Teachers College. And so this woman, Missy Purcell, became a disciple of this Lucy Calkins and was spreading that type of reading methodology in her school to her students. And what was the result? And again, this is why I think this chapter is so important, is because it gets beyond just the fact that the studies show that, what they show. It's what happens to the children. She said that after all the time they spent in her classroom, she would have all of these kids who would leave her 5th grade classroom not being able to read. And she said, we had to stop the interview at one point because she got emotional. And she said that it always tears her up because she remembers this one girl that she left her class. She knew that this girl could not read after leaving her fifth grade class. And she always wondered what was going to happen to these kids. So she would follow them on social media. So she followed this girl on Facebook. This girl ended up having a dead end, low paying job. And Missy said that she always wonders, how much was I responsible for that? Because I never taught that girl how to read. If I had taught her how to read, then she could have, had a great future. But I failed in my job. But the problem was, she was unfortunately the instrument of this failure. But the true cause was the teacher prep program and the ideology that was being taught to those prospective teachers. And that all filtered down. It was the trickle down, from the schools of ed down to the teachers, down to the kids. It's like when the schools of education peed, it all landed on the kids eventually. And so I think that's every time I read that chapter, it just really angers me. Like, I wrote the book, right? And it still angers me when I read my own writing. And so I think that it's really important to look at her particular story and how it impacted her kid. And she only realized that she had totally failed her kids because she ended up having her own child who was dyslexic, sending her dyslexic kid to the same school and being taught using the same methods by other teachers, and her kid couldn't read. And then she decided, I've got to find out what works. And she eventually found out that phonics and all this other stuff, science of reading, works. And then she got so angry that she was failed by the system, and then she failed her kids.
You make an interesting point, and I'm wondering how many of these universities are still teaching, the three Qing. So when these states and the public school systems are trying to shift back to phonics, how many of these teachers aren't prepared because they've gone through the system, the education system at the college level, and they've been taught a different way.
Yeah,
Um,
no, I think that's a really important question, Shelley. And let me just say to everybody that in one of my chapters, I think it was either chapter 3 or chapter 4. Actually, I think it's chapter 3 on the whole background of reading and what works. I actually quote Shelley in my book. So if you're going to buy my book for any reason, buy it for the fact that I'm quoting Shelley. So
I'm a very
um,
small piece of your book, Lance, but thank you.
I appreciate you taking the time to be interviewed for the book, Shelley. Anyway, but uh, so the what are the chances that we can change some of this stuff, right? If you look at uh, the schools of education around the country, not just in a particular state, but around the country, the National Council for Teacher Quality, which is an unbelievably great research organization that puts out incredible empirical studies on what works when it comes to teaching and educating our kids. And so the National Council on Teacher Quality, the NCTQ, put out a study called the Teacher Prep Review and strengthening elementary reading instruction, in the United States, something like that. Anyway, but they looked at, did a survey of the schools of education across the country, not just in one state, but across the country. And they found that, and they use as their grading system, how closely did these schools of education teach the science of reading, the elements of the science of reading to their prospective teachers. And it's shocking that the majority of the schools of education in this country received a D or an F when it came to teaching the basic reading instructional techniques that work. In my own home state of California, and everything's worse in California, right? And so it's so in California, they surveyed 41 different higher education teacher preparation programs. Out of the 41, 31 received a D or an F. And so, it's unsurprising that that the reading scores are so bad here. And when the California Teachers Association says that we need to give autonomy to the teachers in the classroom to give them the discretion to choose the methods they deem best for their kids, that's a totally hollow argument, because the teachers have never been taught what best to teach. If they went to school in California, chances are they were never taught. They were like Missy Purcell. only a California versions of that. So, I mean, that's a totally bogus argument, but of course it comes from the teachers union. So by definition, it's bogus. And so, um, you know, the, uh, I think that one of the things that is hopeful is the fact that more and more states, though, are understanding because the reading scores are so bad. In fact, the current national reading scores are so bad, they're the worst in more than 20 years. And so, and the problem is that even if some states change to a pro phonics reading agenda, that we've got kids in the system, in the pipeline, who will still never be able to read. Okay, you change the program for reading for K-3 kids, right? Well, what about the 4th to 12th graders? How are you going to get them to read? Even if those kids at the early grades, are taught to read, and so we're going to have this lost generation of kids who are going to go on to higher education. And one last point, and we can go on to your next question. But one last point is that when these kids get to higher education, what professors are finding is that these kids cannot handle reading assignments anymore, and that uh, professors who had routinely assigned 20, 30 pages of reading to their kids find out now that these kids in college cannot handle 10-page assignments, and they rebel at that. And so there's that. There's also the fact that in mathematics, the same lack of preparation is causing these kids to come into college in mathematics with poor algebra skills. How can you do calculus if you have poor algebra skills? I interviewed a teacher, a college professor who teaches calculus. He says that in his calculus class, 70 to 80% of the kids drop out of his calculus class because they don't have good algebra skills. And he said that of those kids who remain, if you were to pick them up and then place them in a high-performing math country like Singapore, that 95% of them would fail. And so what's the result? He says that Silicon Valley companies in his area will not take his graduates because they can't do the work.
Yeah, one of the things that I saw when I was in the classroom, and especially in math, they didn't have enough teachers, so they would put kind of a warm body in there who didn't know how to teach math. So you have a freshman taking Algebra 1 with a teacher who can't teach Algebra 1, and that student isn't only set up for failure that year. They're set up for failure in the ongoing years. So there are just so many problems
It's a
there.
pipeline of failure. It's a
Yeah,
pipeline of failure.
yeah. Let me see here. Recommendations for school board members. What recommendations do you have for school board members who want to improve academic achievement around the board?
Well, if you are, hopefully want to, if you don't already, if you want to implement, let's say, a science of reading curriculum in your school district, I think, I'm not going to recommend a particular curriculum because there are a lot of good curricula out there. But I think that one of the things that you can take a look at, and I think it's a very good tool for school board members, your superintendents, your principals, is something that's put out by the Ohio Department of Education and Workforce, the Ohio Department of Education and Workforce. And they have a document called Read Ohio. And what it includes, and I can send the link to you, Shelley, so you can distribute it amongst all the people on this webinar. They have this science of, and you can't see it, right? Science of reading toolkit. And it's not just, hey, these are good curricula. What it is it gives advice to superintendents, to educators, to principals, and people like yourself, policymakers, about how you should go about the process of adopting a science of reading curriculum in your district. How to engage your parents, what sorts of things to look for when you're looking at curricula, and what questions to ask. And it's a real great practical nuts and bolts process that they outline for all of you about how to go through that and choose the best curriculum that's right for your school, but based upon the science of reading. And I think that's something that I think for policymakers like you is really important because, I even if you're elected and you have maybe some, I know that in the school board members that I've talked to, I have a good friend of mine who is a school board member here in the Sacramento area where I live. And she's a conservative. She got elected to her local elementary school district and a board, and she just finished reading my book. And she said she had no idea about any of this stuff that I talked about in my book. I mean, like really zero idea. And and especially when it came to reading, she said she had no idea that that's what was going on with reading, and that's why things were so bad. And so I think that to have not only my book that describes the problem and the reasons for it, but then also something like what the Ohio Department of Education Workforce put out in order how to actually then go about the process once you realize that there is a problem that needs to be corrected and you need to adopt some kind of curriculum. They actually lay it out for you. So I think that's a very good tool for everybody to take a look at.
All right. I know you've only got about 10 more minutes here. I wanted to, if anybody's got any questions, you can just maybe type question in the chat and you guys can ask if want to ask Lance any questions.
I thought Marty had a question.
Well, I in Virginia, and anyone can correct me if I'm wrong, we have this Virginia Literacy Act, which is my understanding mandates that we use science of reading-based curricula. And so I'm wondering if, at least in our state, if the schools of education will respond to that, realizing that their graduates are going to be forced to use science of reading-based materials, whether they will respond to that and start to teach them about those materials. Time will tell, I guess.
Marty, that's a really, really good question. It's critically important because you have to have buy-in from higher education. If you're going to pass a law, now I'm not sure about Virginia. I'm a great admirer of Governor Youngkin. I think he's done a great job in your state. I'm not sure, in terms of the branches of higher education in your state, whether there's been a buy-in or there's been resistance. I do know, for example, that, and this is, it's kind of shocking actually when you think about it, in New York, which is of course deep blue, you have Kathy Hochul, who in her current just enacted 2025 budget has done something somewhat similar to what Virginia has, where they have enacted a back to basics phonics reading program initiative in New York State that's going to, amongst one of the key aspects of this initiative, is to train and retrain teachers in New York State to be able to use science of reading. And so I thought that was really interesting when Kathy Hochul put out her information piece on this Back to Basics initiative, that you had these quotes from the heads of the major branches of New York public higher education, like the State University of New York, City University of New York, these institutions that train the bulk of teachers in New York State, all saying that they support what the governor is doing, that they will then change according to what the budget is pushing. And so, I mean, again, it's like the devil is in the details, right? I mean, you can say you're going to change, but then not really. But at least there seems to be at least that verbal buy-in. I think the other thing that as school board members you are seeing is that that need to be recognized is that it's not just the university schools of education that are the problem, right? You also have professional development. Because like teachers who have already gone into the system, well, they're not going to be influenced by what the school of education that they went to 20 years ago is doing now, right? They're going to be influenced by maybe what they're getting in professional development. So you have control over that as, district policymakers. And so it's, it's the same thing like when it comes to issues like critical race theory equity, all those social justice issues that are being crammed down the throats of teachers and districts through professional development, you have the same power over that as you do over the reading instructions. So if you have professional development dollars that are at your discretion, I mean, look to see how you can use those dollars to ensure that your teachers now are able to teach science of reading. Because you can pass these laws in the state capitals, but if they're not implemented well in the districts, and the people who are carrying them out are not given the training, they're going to fail. I mean, and I'll give us an example. You think about when the schools closed down and we all went to remote learning, right? Now, I wrote a book on blended remote learning. Done right, it can really be a huge asset. But what I found in my book, a number of books ago that I wrote, this was called Moonshots in Education. And but what I found, I interviewed a teacher at a high school here in California who did know how to do remote learning competently and effectively. And I asked, what percentage of the teachers in your school are able to do that? And she said 5% at most. So she said, so basically 95% of the teachers in her school could not do that type of instruction. And this was like a couple years right before COVID. And those were the teachers who were then going to be forced to use remote learning techniques in order to teach the kids. And no wonder it all collapsed.
Cheryl, did you want to ask a question? I think she's talking about like math. How do you improve math when you can't find the teacher, enough teachers to even teach math that know math?
Yeah, well, again, it's what you're going to have to do, and this is the problem. There's several problems. That's a great question. Is that Cheryl who asked that question? Cheryl, a great question, because there's several levels to that issue, right? There's the how do you best teach math, right? The trouble with there's how you teach math, but then where you going to get the teachers? Well, okay, how are those teachers taught in the schools of education? And then also too, where are you going to get the teachers? So there's three aspects to your question. So what's being taught? Well, because so many states went to Common Core, during the 2010s, and even when states have supposedly changed their state standards away from Common Core, they're really many of them based on Common Core. Well, what Common Core has done is that it has pushed in this new progressive math methodologies into the classroom, which are totally ineffective. And the math tutors that I interviewed for the book, will tell you that these kids are being taught math in the most inefficient and ineffective way. So, for example, like let's say you wanted to multiply fractions. Let's say you wanted to multiply 1/2 times 3/4, right? So all of us who remember our math will say, okay, we multiply the numerators 1 times 3, and we multiply the denominators 2 times 4, and what's the answer? It's 3/8, right? But that's not how the kids are being taught now. The kids are being taught that in order to do this problem, you've got to draw a picture. So you have to draw a picture. You have to then divide the rectangle that you draw into all these parts, shade in the parts, and eventually you will get the answer 3/8. Well, even if you got the answer 3/8, imagine trying to do that for 20 problems, right? And how long is that going to take you? And the problem is that these kids are not getting the foundational skills that are then become automatic. Like you memorize your times table. Why do you do that? You memorize it because it's automatic in your head, so you can use it when you do algebra and stuff like that. Well, no wonder kids can't do algebra, because they've been taught using these ineffective methods to learn math. In fact, I'll give you one more example. When you have the simple problem, 3 times 8 equals what? 24, right? Well, you know how Common Core will tell you how to do that? They'll say, use your fingers. So you count by 3s. 1, 2, 3. Okay, you count that 8 times, make those groups. How many then is that after that? It's 24, right? Well, or else they say not only counting fingers, but you can do head bobs, right? Can you imagine the kid doing 24 head bobs, you know, I mean, you go crazy, literally, you know, get headaches at least if you're doing that. Imagine, you know, you're being asked, you know, multiply 70 times 100. Imagine doing that. And so 7,000 head bobs. Anyway, but, you know, these kids are not taught the standard algorithm in mathematics until much later. So, for example, in long division, you're not taught under Common Core long division until like the 6th grade. I mean, the standard algorithm. You're taught all these progressive, indirect ways, and then that doesn't prepare you for algebra in the 8th grade. And so, therefore, you're not then prepared to eventually do calculus in the 12th grade. And so, it's just a domino effect. So, there's that. Then there's the schools of education who are actually pushing this type of stuff, and kids are coming out of, are in school with these progressive techniques being totally confused. And teachers, I did a study on the schools of education here in California, and what the textbooks for the teachers are telling them in mathematics is don't worry if your kids are confused, because confusion, and this is a literal quote from the textbook for the teachers. Don't worry if they're being confused, if they're confused, because confusion is essential to the process. Well, I don't know about you, but when I was in math, the last thing I wanted to be was confused. And because what happens with confusion is you become frustrated and you don't learn. And that's what these tutors is happening, is that these kids are not learning because they're confused. And I was just at my dental hygienist who was cleaning my teeth and said, when I told her I wrote this book, it was like the dam burst, right? She started like unloading on me about the math instruction at her school. And she said that, you know, they were teaching her kid all these new math, you know, circuitous ways to get to the answer. And her kid was was totally confused. And so she hired a tutor. Now she's an immigrant mom, and she hired a tutor from her, you know, who had also been born in the same old country, and taught her child the standard algorithm. Her child goes back, and she understands that, and it's like all of a sudden the light bulb comes up. She goes back to the school and, you know, does a test, gets 100% correct answers, but gets an F because she didn't use the correct method process in order to get to the right answer that they taught using new math Common Core. And so therefore, you know, the family just threw their hands up, because what is that? You know, because at the end of the day, what does Silicon Valley want? They want the right answers. You know, they don't want the you know, a method that take you 2 hours to do 2 minutes of work. The third thing that Cheryl that you speak to is that why don't we have enough STEM teachers? Is because part of the reason is because of the free markets working, right? People with STEM skills can get paid a lot more in private industry, and they'll go there instead of going to teach at a school. Union contracts, if you happen to be in a state that requires collective bargaining, will require uniform salary schedules. There's not a general teacher shortage in this country. There's a teacher shortage in specific fields. The fields of STEM are the ones where you have huge deficits in terms of teachers, and that's because a STEM teacher is going to be paid the same as a PE coach. You know, so I mean, you know, not to get political, but you know, Albert Einstein will get paid the same as Tim Waltz.
That's so funny. So, you know, I just have a comment, if you don't mind. This is Cheryl speaking. During COVID, I ended up homeschooling my daughter because the online education was just horrific. And so I found a program online. It's called Acellus. Yeah. And I thought it was genius because the platform, first of all, the ease of use was fantastic. If my daughter was taking, let's say, an Algebra 1 class, there were 3 different video links for the same lesson that had been perfected. So she could click on teacher A, she'd run the video of, I mean, it could be a video on integers, right? She watched this person's explanation of integers with kind of a Khan Academy type camera where you could see everything. She could stop it, play it, rewind it, do whatever. Let's say that teacher was kind of a fast talker. Well, so she would click on teacher B. and that teacher might have been more sing-songy and maybe a female or whatever, and put a different little flavor to it. But she had ample opportunity to learn based on excellent teaching. So my thought, and I've said this for quite a while now, with the education system and where it's headed, I feel like the teachers who are going to get at one point, or hopefully paid the most, are going to be the ones who are talented, who can put out a product that is useful to the general public. And that's where I think at some level, I hate to say it, education is probably headed, because we don't have these STEM teachers. But if you can create some type of content that you can provide to the public education system, you can sell it and market that curriculum. This one person can do it, and they can do it effectively because of all the online learning that is taking place today. So I just was wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah. And you know, and Shelly, don't worry. I'll stay on for a little while longer because I know we have a lot of questions.
Yeah, Lance, when you have to go, I know you've got a lot going on. So
no, that's okay. I mean, these are great questions. I want to answer a few more questions. And Cheryl, that's very true. I actually wrote a book, let's see, 2 books ago called The Homeschool Boom, which is all about the explosion in homeschooling in America. And I wrote that during the pandemic. And that's continued, as you know, even after the pandemic has subsided, that, you know, people are still homeschooling because they found out it was so effective for their kid. And they can do it because you don't have to be a rocket scientist in order to do that. One of the things that I've recommended to people is that people don't realize that there is this unbelievable market of curricula available to homeschoolers. And people think that, oh, I'm just going to have to take the textbook that they're using at the public school and teach it at home. That's not what you have to do, right, Cheryl? I mean, you can, you know, pick and choose Acellus or any of these, you know, other curricula in math, science, reading, whatever, you know, for your kid, and tailor it to the needs of your child. There's a great site, and you're probably aware of this site, called KathyDuffyReviews.com. And they are a site that reviews curricula for homeschoolers. And they will tell you, you know, what's in the curricula, you know, who would benefit most by it, you know, and all the details. And, you know, it's kind of a one-stop shop in terms of like trying to get up to speed on, you know, which curriculum would be right for your child. Because, you know, while you want more choices, if you're presented with a gazillion choices, then you have to then wonder how to make the right choice. And so that's a good way to you know, have somebody advising you on how to best make that good choice. And I think that school, you know, has so many benefits, and I think that really it is the wave of the future. I know all of you are, you know, school board members on public school districts, and you know, I hope that what people take from this is that whatever good things are happening in these other sectors of education, whether it's charter schools, private schools under school choice, or in the homeschooling market, whatever's working there, you know, how can those successful aspects be implemented in the public system? And one of the ways is, you know, through effective curriculum.
I think, Marty, well, if you want to make your comment, and then Deb, if you want to give a little testimonial, it's Dr. Wallstrom. Lance, I think you met her in Texas.
Oh, I didn't know that was Deb Wallstrom.
Yeah. So we'll let Deb give you some positive feedback about your book, and then we'll end.
So what I wanted to say was I was a faculty member in mathematics at Virginia Tech for my entire working career. And by the way, I'm a product of the California Community College system. I went 2 years to Contra Costa Community College. We had a very good graduate student who wanted to be involved in mathematics education. And so she left the math department and went over to the College of Education for about a semester. And then she came back and said she couldn't do it over there because there was just so much baloney in the curriculum that she gave up on that. And so I think that may happen to some of the students who would be most able to be good math teachers. They're just so turned off by all the stuff that they have to go through a standard to get a standard education degree. Now, I think there are beginning to be efforts. I know we have some here locally to certify people as teachers who don't come in with a standard education degree. So that may be one way to kind of open up another pipeline to get qualified people, maybe people who've been want a second career in teaching, who've worked as an engineer somewhere. So the more opportunities like that allow people to bypass the standard education training, that might be one thing that would help.
I absolutely agree, Marty. I think that you're spot on. Is that if we can get alternative certification based upon subject field knowledge, and that's the problem, is that so many of these people who are coming out, of the schools of education may take math education courses, but they don't know math, and that's a huge problem. What's interesting is that because you're coming from a math background, Marty, if you read the math section of my book, what you'll find is that the first chapter that profiles someone is a guy named Sugi Sorenström, and he is one of the top software engineers for Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And he sends his kid to a public school in Los Angeles County, and his district has this really progressive, crappy, ineffective curriculum that they're foisting on the kids. And like most of the parents who have any means are having their kids tutored, right? Now here's one of the top guys at JPL, and he basically runs the world's antenna system that speaks to the deep space network up there, right? You have to go through him in order to do that. He's telling the school district that you have a crappy math curriculum that kids aren't learning. That's why they're all going to tutoring. And the district refuses to listen to him, because they bought into this ideology that it's like a religious faith to these people, right? That you're questioning my religious beliefs by saying this. You're a heretic. You're not a scientist. Deb.
Hey, if you've seen Lance and how passionate he is, his entire book feels that way. I had a chance to read it all yesterday, and I just want to say kudos, Lance. It was so good. And you're just bringing us back down to ground level where we need to be thinking. And there are so many gems in that book. I wanted to highlight the entire thing practically. I just want to say I'm just so impressed always with your writing and your thinking and your passion for getting things better and your realistic, practical point of sharing with people the things we really need to be thinking about. And I love the book. If you haven't read it, it's a very, very good read.
Oh, thank you, Deb. There's no one I respect in the education research space more than Deb Walston.
Oh,
it's true. I mean, Deb wrote a great book on how policymakers like you can use research in order to inform policy. One of the things that we do, and Shelley knows this, is that our institute does training programs, training conferences for school board members in states across the country. So we do training programs for board members in Texas, in Washington State, in Arizona, in California. We're going to expand next year to Oregon. And so, and we invited Deb to do a presentation to one of our conferences, and she did a fantastic job. I think it was in Texas, right, Deb?
It was in Texas. Yes, sir.
And so she did a fantastic job speaking to the board members in Texas. But I think that, that's the important thing, is to be able to take the research and then translate it into policy.
Yeah.
And then, because if there's a disconnect, then it doesn't matter if we've got the best research in the world, right, Deb? If it doesn't ever make it into policy, it might as well never have been conducted.
That's exactly right. Yes, sir.
Yep. And so, I appreciate those kind comments. I'll tell you, Deb, if you ever wanted to write me an email to write down some of those kind comments and have them in writing, I'd appreciate that.
I'll do it.
those of us in the nonprofit space always have to have testimonials for our work,
Yeah.
right?
Yes, yes.
Right. You know that, right, Deb? So that
Yes, sir.
if we're going to have a book after the Great Classroom Collapse, we have to convince other people that, hey, it'd be good to finance that. Look at what
Yeah.
somebody like Deb Wallstrom says.
Yeah.
And thank you, Deb. I appreciate that so much.
All right, Lance. Well, thank you so much. I know you've got lots to do, so we are going to let you hop off of here. But thank you guys all for showing up, and I'm just so thankful. Lance, you're just awesome. Thank you for all that you're doing and continue to do. And follow him on the Pacific Research Institute. There's some great articles on there about education. It's often updated, and thank you so much.
I will. For those of you interested in reading, I am going to have a very long essay on reading that will be appearing in the next edition of, some of you may be aware of a really great publication called First Things. So it's going to, it's a 2,000 word piece on reading, a lot of what we talked about here. And so keep a lookout for whenever the new edition of First Things comes out, it should have my article. I think you really enjoy. You can get my book, The Great Classroom Collapse, on Amazon, in case you want to, hike up my sale numbers and then distribute them to, maybe others on your boards, and who should read it, especially to those who may be on the fence about stuff,
Yeah.
and who are wondering, well, do you have any evidence for that? Because they always ask that, right? You say, well, we should do this. Well, do you have any evidence for that? Well, speaking of which, Anyway, so thanks a lot. Let me ask one last question. So, Shelley, is this is recorded? Would I be able to access this at some point?
Absolutely. I'll send you a link. I've got to, like, after I've got to render it and do a couple things to it, but when it's ready, I'll send it to you.
Okay.
And then any good information that you run across that you think would help our board members, send it my way and I will push it out.
I'm going to send you some of the links I talked about during the my talk today, and so that people can access the articles and the references. All right. For everybody for attending and listening to me, and hope you like the book. And then I'll talk to you sometime very soon, Shelley. So I'm going to go off the air right now.
Okay. Thank you so much, Lance. Have a good day.
Okay. Thank you. And thanks, Deb.
You're
Bye.
welcome, Lance.